Read about a new government initiative or program, and likely it's not coming from actions of Congress. More and more federal policy is being established via executive order from the president, which has left Congress as a legislative body kind of on the sidelines. For some insight into how we got here and what it could mean for future administrations, we bring in Joshua Spivak, Senior Fellow at the Hugh Carey Institution for Government Reform at Wagner College. Mr. Spivak, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So this is not a policy discussion. This is more, or agree or disagree of what's going on, because it's actually been kind of a balanced approach here of just giving the executive branch of the U.S. government more and more leeway in judgment into what federal policy is. And Congress is just kind of, whether their party's in or not in, become sort of just cheerleaders for or against those policies. Do I have that right? Am I summing it up correctly as someone who covers this stuff?
Yes, I think that's very true, that Congress has taken a step back, an enormous step back from what it was originally supposed to be and what it was for many years to now almost the third, kind of barely the third branch of government at this point.
As a political science major, obviously had to go into a little constitutional theory there. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Congress was supposed to be kind of the end-all be-all, and the president was supposed to be kind of just there to sign the checks and, dot the I's sort of thing.
Right. It may be just like a human nature thing where, okay, there's one guy in charge. But when they did the Constitutional Convention, they were very focused on Congress. They put it as the Article 1. There was a state, Pennsylvania, one of the most important states, that did not have a governor, that specifically did not have a governor, but the reason that they wanted a president was they didn't like what was happening in Pennsylvania. That was one of the ideas of let's get a new government in place. So they put this, when they came in for the discussion, most of the early debate is about how do we create a Congress, what's its role, what's its powers. The thought about the executive, the big thought was there's a guy sitting in front of the room who's presiding over this body. And that guy, George Washington, is going to be the first guy in charge, and he'll figure it out. And he did. He did a great job, really created this idea of a modern president that had not existed in humankind ever. And it worked for a while, but now we're really running into trouble with Congress basically out of the picture. Part of that is what's happening in government, in the elections, in society as a whole, where there's this divide and there's the entire electoral process at this point feels very calcified. And if you look at what's happening, even though there's continual change in who's in power, the change is sort of impossible to lead to big change in government.
We're speaking with Joshua Spivak. He is a senior fellow at Wagner College. So from the historical side, when did things kind of start going this way? Was it FDR's big deal, or were things getting more solidified into the executive branch before then?
Well, I would say that the biggest thing, the big start would maybe be Abe Lincoln, the Civil War, that really kind of made the executive more powerful. But as Trump has said, McKinley is really a major divide in where things start changing. And in fact, you see with the executive orders, they really started being used very heavily by Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and others. And actually, they've used them less since the days of Roosevelt, both Roosevelts. But that the earlier Gilded Age, from after the Civil War to McKinley, actually, our current political system seems very attuned to that, except Congress was in charge, not the president. But there's a very deep connection between our current political dynamic and that time period in terms of changes in Congress, in terms of changes in the president, in terms of how little change there is in votes, which is kind of interesting.
You talked about the political pendulum kind of swinging back and forth, and that almost touches the human nature as well, whereas it's almost as if we want one person in charge just so we know who to blame or who to congratulate. And Congress nowadays, members of Congress will stand up there during their general speeches and lament of how Congress as a body isn't doing its job, and it's almost like tragedy of the commons, where since no one's in charge, then, we can just blame Congress and nobody really gets in trouble.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so think about if we go back just to the 2002 election, where the Congress was 51-45 Republican, right? So pretty close to what it is today. But of those Democrats, of the 49 Democrats, 19 were elected in a state that has no Democratic senators today. And there's states that are so Republican. All four North and South Dakota senators were Democrats. So the result was there was a lot more give and take between the parties. Similarly, though the control of Congress has shifted, and though the control of the presidency keeps shifting, there's actually a very small swing in the in actual votes. So between 64 and 76, every single election saw a 20-point swing from the previous election. In the 21st century, we haven't seen a 10-point swing. It's just this very slim majority, and there's changes each time, but for the most part, we're just stuck in this calcified situation, and that's actually kind of what happened in the Gilded Age. So it is pretty interesting. Also, in the Gilded Age, by the way, we had the only president who was elected non-consecutively. So there's a lot of, and I don't want to make too much of that overlap, but it is an interesting thing that there's this calcification, and we can't seem to break out of it at the moment.
We spent most of our time looking rearward. Let's look forward. I mean, what does this mean for, we can just even say just the arena of foreign policy with an ally that wants to work with us. If we're going back and forth every 4 years and we're not having consistency in our policies, whether it is domestic or foreign, does that make things kind of harder to establish? And every 4 years you have to worry about if you're going to have health care or not, or, something like that.
Yeah, I think that's, a real big problem for our allies and our enemies. Perhaps that may be good for our enemies to be off kilter, but not so much for our allies. For corporations, so for instance, Trump said he's not enforcing the FCPA at the moment. Should corporations hold by this or expect that in 4 years everything's going to change and maybe I could be prosecuted for what I did before? So it's a lot of very unstable dynamic. And so legislation, the value of legislation is you can't get rid of it so easily. But with an executive order, you put it in place with the stroke of a pen and you remove it with the stroke of a pen. So FDR put in all these executive orders. Some of them were tossed out by the courts, but our current system, the New Deal system, really is still in place. And things like insider trading, the SEC, all of that, all of our securities laws that underpin government were really legislative more so than executive orders. And that has allowed companies our current finance system to really develop through that. We don't see any of these changes. In the 21st century, outside of Obamacare, it seems really just playing with taxes that has been the way government has operated. They haven't done major lasting legislation that you could expect 20 years from now to still be impacting people's lives in the same way.
Time for my final and impossible question, which is, are we going to just see more and more of the same, where an executive is in charge, controlling all government activity, and once again, Congress is either there to root rah-rah forward or rah-rah against it, or we might see some sort of constitutional amendments? Is there any talk that you've heard in circles of political trustees of whether or not they recognize this might be a problem?
Well, I can't see a constitutional amendment working or a constitutional convention because you need so many people. You can't do it with just 50-50. But I think what's happened in society, and this is, again, I guess, going back to that Gilded Age, but going back to every other point in history, it goes one way until it stops going that way. And you don't really expect it to stop. So I would not be surprised if one day it just veers very much to one direction or veers very much to the other. That's what happened with McKinley. That's what happened with Roosevelt. To some degree, you could think of maybe that's what happened with Trump due to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the crash in 2008. Maybe there was really a backlash. And we're seeing that here, where we have kind of very different presidents than we had before. Who knows when that would be, though? But I think we definitely should expect that there will be some change in how it goes. The electorate has changed quite a bit, even though the numbers are the same. educated voters were kind of Republican. Now they're very